With a new COVID pill being proven to be only 30% effective, what's the real reason it's been approved? I have no opinion on this new COVID medication. It might be wonderful, it might not be. The indications from the clinical trials is that it's 30% effective, and I offer no opinion other than it is 30% effective. You could say that that's in a glass half empty type way. It's 70% not effective. To Her Majesty the Queen and her friends at Merck. The drug known as molnupiravir was recommended in a 13-10 vote after data were presented showing its modest effect on reducing hospitalisation. The decision was made despite members of the panel going back and forth on the drug's effectiveness, safety, and whether it could potentially aid the virus's mutation capabilities. Bloody hell, 10 of the 23 people went, oh, don't look at this. What if it aids the virus's mutation capacity? Well, that's 13. We like it. I was not convinced that the potential benefit outweighed the risk, said Dr. Pete Weiner. Don't be so bloody childish. The director of the Office of Research Protections at the Defence Health Agency. The efficacy of this product is not overwhelmingly good, one panel member said. I think we really have to be careful about saying that this is the way to go, said Dr. David Harvey, who still voted to recommend the drug. So even some of the people who voted for it weren't that bloody convinced. We now routinely face immoral situations, like last week's news that pharmaceutical giant Merck is planning to charge Americans $712 for a COVID drug that only cost $17 to produce and whose development was subsidised by the American government. That is astonishing, isn't it? And it is indeed immoral. You paid for that, Americans, and now when they're selling it back to Americans, even though it's only 30% effective, they're charging 70 quid. It should be 30% of 17, given that it's 30% effective, which I think is about $8. No, 7. 6. Oh, damn you, maths. That's just the latest example of the absurd paradigm. We take the risk of investing early in the product, but instead of that investment reaping us something valuable like affordable prices, we are rewarded with price gouging by the drug makers that bankroll the lawmakers who've rigged the rules and aim to keep them rigged. That's not a free market, it's a top-down command economy perfectly calibrated for price gouging, and the pharmaceutical industry and its puppet politicians want to keep it that way. Do you see that the mantras of free markets that are continually used to prevent alternative ideologies from gaining any traction in the public sphere are not being adhered to even by those who espouse them? Calibrated market, public funding, profits returning into corporate hands. It seems to be a set of relationships that are interdependent, that hold one another up while just doing what's necessary to prevent the sphere of their influence and power and privilege being burst. So when you find out that a pill is only 30% effective, and when you begin to understand the relationships between the government, the FDA and big pharma, you begin to question what motives and agenda might be at play when a drug of that nature is approved. It makes you query whether or not it's about medical efficacy or profit. Let's see if lobbying could play any part in this. Big Pharma is still the largest lobbying spender. The pharmaceuticals and health products industry spent about $92 million on lobbying in the first quarter of the year, more than any other industry. Wow, just in a quarter of a year, 3 months, 30 million a month. £1 million a day. £1 million a day of that profit that you paid for in some cases goes into bending the ear of government officials into creating structures, administration and bureaucracy that is advantageous to them. So when a new 30% effective pill appears on the market, do you think it has a connection with that 30 million a month of lobbying? A new House report targets 14 pharmaceutical companies for spending more on stock buybacks and dividends than they did on research and development over a 5-year period. So in a sense, the pharmaceuticals is just a side hustle. The real business is the stock buybacks and dividends. That's extraordinary. The 14 companies spent a combined $31 million in the first quarter of 2021 on lobbying. Pfizer spent the most of the 14 companies on lobbying. So if a company spends a lot of money on lobbying and then seem to find themselves in an advantageous position, do you think that there is a connection between the lobbying and the advantage? Increasingly, it's getting difficult to discuss those things. Recently, we talked about Trevor Noah getting criticised for suggesting that the president of Moderna or Pfizer or one of them had profits in mind when sort of publicly lobbying for new booster shots around the Omicron variant. How can it be, oh, you're anti-vax, you're suspicious? You wouldn't get people being cynical, suspicious and full of doubt if there was an open public discourse and clearer, more defined and regulated relationships between government and the pharmaceutical industry. Like, every avenue of potential dissent is shut down. Freedom of speech, criticism, jokes, conversation, all shut down. Not because, what, to protect you? To protect me? No, to protect them. Now, we've talked about Big Pharma. We've talked about the government. We've talked about lobbying. But we should be okay because the pharmaceutical industry, they're not just out there doing what they want, like the Wild West, creating things, selling things. They're regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA has moved from an entirely taxpayer-funded entity to one increasingly funded by user fees paid by manufacturers that are being regulated. So the FDA is increasingly funded by the people it regulates. So you fund the research, they lobby the government, the FDA is paid for by the companies that it regulates increasingly. Do you think that sounds like a recipe for transparency, authenticity, integrity, efficacy? Or do you think that it's not unfeasible that that could create a climate where profit acceded to the forefront of people's minds? Today, close to 45% of its budget comes from user fees that companies pay when they apply for approval of a medical device or drug. I mean, isn't that mental, a user fee? We know what that is. That's a kind of a compliance fee. They dress it up in little bits of language, but there's a financial relationship between the regulatory body and the companies that they're regulating. Do you not see how that could create corruption? Changes in more recent years have also increased the number of standard new drug applications approved the first time round by the FDA from 38% in 2005 to 61% in 2018. In diseases where there are not many medication options for patients, 89% of new drug applications were approved the first time round. Wow, that's worse, isn't it? When you've not got many options, nearly 90% of them are approved first time. Most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has seen FDA provide emergency use authorization for potential treatments in a matter of weeks, not months. What we can point out using hard evidence gleaned by professional journalists, compiled here by us on this channel, is that there are relationships between the government, big business, regulatory bodies that might lead to a new wonder drug with a 30% efficacy rating getting approved for market because of the conditions, the environment, and what that environment advantages, and what the priorities of those relationships are. Don't be so bloody childish.